recording now. Okay. Again, welcome everybody. My name is Peggy Kurtz. This meeting is being hosted by Rockland Sierra Club, which is part of Lower Hudson Group. This meeting is also co-sponsored, and we want to thank all of our wonderful co-sponsors: 350 New Jersey Rockland, Third Act Upstate, Sustainable Hudson Valley, and the Rockland Coalition to End the New Jim Crow. We want to thank everybody for helping to get out the word about this program. As I mentioned, we'll leave plenty of time for questions. Please hold your questions till the end. Either put them in the chat or raise your hand at the end. We're thrilled to be able to present again, this is our second time, a talk by Professor Klaus Jacob. Klaus spoke for us way back in 2017, but I know, climate science changes all of the time. And I remember that at that time, the room was packed. His message is very important for all of us in the Hudson Valley, as well as northern New Jersey and New York City, really, really anywhere, to hear what we can expect in the short term and in the long term as well. Dr. Jacob is Emeritus Research Professor at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory in Palisades. He's also a renowned earthquake, disaster, and climate expert with a focus on disaster risk management, with his most current research on rising sea levels, climate change, and disaster-resilient megacities. An expert on the local impacts of climate change, he has also served on the New York City Mayor's Panel on Climate Change. In 2012, he was named by Time Magazine as one of the 50 people who matter globally for forecasting ahead of time and in detail the impacts of a Hurricane Sandy-like superstorm on New York City. So with that, I'll give the mic over to Professor Jacob. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Peggy, and thanks for all the organization in the Hudson Valley and in New Jersey for showing up and hopefully doing good work in the future. I will now try to share my screen. And it travels, and I think, can you see it? My screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Now I
Looks
will,
good.
well, now I need to turn on my, so you see that? The big screen with the title slide?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, then we can start. So I want to talk about climate change risks and the adaptation needs for our area here. The topic that I want to cover in more detail is on this slide. I first want to give a big 10,000-year picture about particularly sea level rise. Then I want to say something about the concept of risk. And then I want to quickly give an overview about climate change in general, from cause to consequence. In the second part, and this is the longest part, and please keep muted, I want to talk about the impacts, and I will exemplify that mostly with examples from New York City, but a little bit about the Hudson Valley. And I will use for sea level rise and coastal storm surges, at least for the coastal storm surge, Sandy from 2012. And then also a little bit my own village here in the Hudson Valley in Piermont, what are the flood hazards together with forecast sea level rise for the area. And then quickly touch also on not just coastal flooding, but flooding in general, like we had experienced. Please mute. Please mute. From Ida, that was a hurricane in 2021 and extreme precipitation. And of course, we have recently seen a much more severe example of that during Helene, that in North Carolina, in Asheville, dumped as much as 2 feet of water, 24 inches during 12 hours. This was a new record for the East Coast. And then I want to briefly discuss what we should or can do about it, and often we don't yet do about it. That involves short and midterm adaptation measures. Short term means the next few years, midterm means a few decades. But generally speaking, they are not really sustainable. So in the long run, we have to look for sustainable adaptation measures. And that means out to 2100 and even beyond. But we have to get our act together gradually and maybe urgently in some instances when it's long-term projects like infrastructure to address those issues. So here is the overview of sea level rise 20,000 years back and 10,000 years into the future. Now is here 0. So from 20,000 years to about 7,000 years, when the glacial ice masses, the ice sheets in North America and in Scandinavia melted away, that water ended up in the ocean. And so the sea level rise was in the order of 100 meters. That's 300 feet, believe it or not. That's the height of the Palisades, for instance, just to give you a feeling for that. 300 feet, more than 100 meters. And since about 7,000 years to present, please keep muted, from about 7,000 to present, sea level rise was amazingly constant. And the climate itself pretty much too. Now, 7,000 years into the past, that's about the time when what we call civilization, for better or worse, on this earth developed. There were, of course, earlier cultures, but the way we know our cities now, many of them started several thousand years before, and many of them were located on the coast. And that keeps haunting us now, because in the last 100 years or so, we put all these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which means that we can expect any one of these blue curves going up anywhere from about 75 feet to 150 feet in the next few thousand years, depending on how much carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere. And in Greenland and in Antarctica, that's the ice cover right now. And here for this higher curve here, that's how Greenland looks. No ice, and there's just a little bit of ice left in Antarctica. So these are the scenarios that we have to face up to, and we should, of course, aim for the lower level, because otherwise many of our coastal cities would be in deep, deep water. Risk. So what is risk? Well, basically it is the potential for future losses. And often we measure losses, of course, in dollars, but they can be also lives and other cultural and social values. And if we do it probabilistically, then we give this typically as an annual loss, but we can do that also for specific events, for Sandy or any other specific event. If we dig a little deeper into what is risk, here on the bottom, I wrote down the risk is the product of three factors. The hazard, various climate hazards, but it can go also earthquakes or tornadoes or whatever, volcanoes. The assets, our built environment and the population exposed to the hazards, and then the vulnerability of those assets given the hazard, whereby the hazard, as I said, has a probability per year, if we do it probabilistically, or for a given event, what the flood map for Sandy, for instance, okay? And the assets are, of course, our built environment, our cities, our homes, our infrastructure. In the vulnerability of those assets, given the hazard, can vary from 0 to 1. 0 means that whatever the hazard is, nothing happens. It's resilient. 1 means the total asset is lost. And so risk resides where those three domains, hazard, assets, and vulnerability, overlap. Now that we know how to define risk and quantify risk, how do we manage it? Oops. Well, there are various options how to manage it. Here is one. We can, for instance, making that circle called hazards smaller. That means we have to reduce our greenhouse gas output, so those climate hazards don't get as severe as they might get, like sea level rise. Or we can spatially restrict the hazard by barriers, dikes, and other structures, but we can do it also through policies like land use and zoning, that we don't allow assets to be built in hazardous zones. And that's also the domain of urban design. But we also can do the reverse. We can take assets that are right now in hazardous zones and move them out, retreat from hazardous zones. And that's called managed retreat. And we will come back to some of those options later on. Some reason it doesn't want to advance. Here's another option, and that's in the overlapping assets between assets and vulnerability. Depending on engineering codes and structural codes and how our architects design our assets, that determines how vulnerable they are. And so these are some of the options by which we can manage that risk here. Hopefully that will advance. It's a little bit slow. Not sure why. Huh. Okay. So now I want to give an overview of some of the climate change causes and their consequences. Well, as I already said, for about 100 years or so, we put for covering our energy needs, we satisfied them largely with fossil fuels, a little bit hydroelectric energy and a little bit nuclear energy. So we put greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, mostly in the form of carbon dioxide, but there are other ones. That in turn caused global warming, first in the atmosphere, and then with some delay of several decades, up to 100 years, also in the oceans. But when you warm the oceans, the water expands, so the ocean gets bigger, so that causes sea level rise. But that's not the only reason for sea level rise. The other is that those ice masses on Greenland and Antarctica are melting and ending up in the ocean, and that's the second contribution. Currently, we are dominated mostly by thermal expansion, but the melting of the glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica just about overtaking the thermal expansion and will contribute more and more into the future and faster. Now, warmer oceans cause more water to evaporate from the oceans. And warmer atmosphere can hold more moisture. So that combination leads to stronger hurricanes. That leads in turn to more severe coastal storm surges, but also, since the atmosphere is full of this moisture, to more extreme precipitation, and all this leads to either coastal or urban flash flooding or river flooding. There are other parts of the country, not so much here, that for instance, in the southwestern United States, that where the warming leads to a lot more droughts and heat waves. Of course, we occasionally also have more heat waves and warmer heat waves, which in turn, if they last for several weeks, sets up wildfire conditions. And then if a rain falls after a wildfire has devastated a forested area, for instance, that can lead to severe mud flows. We have to be very aware that when we talk about coastal floodings, we always have to combine sea level rise and the hurricanes, meaning coastal storm surges. They together define what our exposure on the coastal area is. Now, why is our built environment so vulnerable? Well, because where we have built, but also how we have built. And that applies both to entire cities, to individual buildings, but also to all of our infrastructure, from transportation to sewer to water, you name it, communication, electricity, and so on. And we have built these things in flood zones, but there we have to be very aware that we can't just look at what the flood zones are now, because we have to plan ahead. So we have to look where the future flood zones will develop with sea level rise in more heavy rainstorms. And FEMA is often way behind in looking into the future. They always look into the past and use that as a guide of the future, which is not a very good guide. We also have built in wildfire zones, particularly in the western states and suburbia. So how we have built? Well, our buildings and homes are often more designed to provide comfort to us, not how safe they are under these extreme conditions. We also have our sewer system, drainage systems are highly inadequate, particularly as the precipitation goes higher and higher and higher and more intense, because we have built so many impermeable surfaces, not just rooftops, parking lots, roadways, you name it. And so this water that comes down doesn't find a way into the sewer system and drainage system. or if it does it in a very short period of time because it can't percolate into the ground, and that leads to heavy flooding, both in rivers, in cities, and in coast. And with respect to wildfire zones, we still build many houses and homes out of wood. Some people even have, believe it or not, wood shingles, which is really not a smart way if you are in a potential wildfire zone. Now, what is our problem? We have known some of those things for quite some time, at least since the 80s, 80s, when Jim Hansen, one of the climate scientists, testified before Congress and told them, you better do something about it. Well, here are the emissions in gigaton of carbon equivalent, carbon dioxide equivalent over the last, 20, 25 years here. And this is still going up, 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 up. We simply ignored those warnings of the climate scientists. And we just love our fossil fuel energy source still. You make gradually some changes that flattened out a little bit. But by 2015, the United Nations called the Paris COP, the Conference of Parties, and an agreement was reached in Paris that future emissions, if they would lead to acceptable temperature rises of maximum 1.5 degrees Celsius, that's about 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit or so, would have to proceed along this curve. By about 2020 or so, they really have to steeply decline, going to almost only the half value by 2030, and then sort of peter out in a long tail towards the end of the century to essentially become zero. Well, that was the Paris Agreement, but the pledges the different nations from the US to Europe to China, India, Brazil, you name it, have done. That's how we have proceeded right now, and there is no change foreseeable in the next few years unless something drastic happens on the international scene, including in the United States. So that's the dilemma that we are facing. We are still asking essentially for havoc by proceeding with using fossil fuel as our main energy source all around the globe. What are the consequences of that? Well, if we take the international pattern of climate change, global mean sea level rise, out to 2300, we see that by about the end of this century, if we follow the Paris Agreement, where emissions reach zero by the year 2100, we could just have 1 meter or 3 feet of sea level rise. And that is manageable. It's not good, but it's manageable. But the way we are behaving right now, we are either here or worse here. And God knows what the next election brings. And we had a president before who canceled Paris. So if the same guy gets elected again, I wouldn't be surprised if he canceled Paris once again. If that's the case, then beyond the year 2100, we can have sea level rise in the tens of feet. That puts a huge burden on future generations. So we are sitting here and have it easy. And depending on how we do in the next few decades, they either will be hit hard or not so hard, still hard, but not so hard. So it's this intergenerational inequity that we potentially provide for our kids and our grandchildren and their children if we are not careful in the decades to come. And that's really the crux and the essence, really, about climate change. Now, in many cases, the local sea level rise, that was the global, is substantially higher than the global average shown here. And that happens to be true, unfortunately, for the New York City area, Hudson Valley, New Jersey coast, and so on. Here is a projection by the New York City Panel on Climate Change, made originally in 2015 and then upgraded in 2019 in inches, but I also have given it in feet and meters here. And that's from 2000 starting as the reference level as 0, what different options might be out just to the year 2100. They are given here as percentile because there are all these different forecasts. And if you take 90 out of 100 of those forecasts, then you would have to take this curve and then all the other values would fall below. But there's still 10% chance that they could be higher. And that's why also in 2019, the NPC updated this and added these funny little blobs here that show that by the year 2090, we are reaching almost 7 feet, and by the year 2100, almost 10 feet. And that is the so-called ARIM scenario. ARIM stands for Arctic Rapid Ice Melt. In other words, if the ice sheet on Antarctica really falls apart faster than most models show, and that's a possibility, even so not a very high chance, but something that we need to contemplate as a possibility, then we could end up with 10 feet here with the year 2100.
Klaus, I can't see your PowerPoint, by the way.
What is that?
You cannot see your PowerPoint.
I can see the PowerPoint, Harry.
Well, then it's just my screen. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
I see it also.
Okay, maybe you have to go out and come back in.
Yeah,
What,
it's
look
okay.
at your view, Harry? Change your view?
Yeah, I'll do that. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Okay, so that's the sea level rise forecast for New York, but that translates all the way through the tidal Hudson Valley, all the way up to the federal dam above Rensselaer, because that's a tidal river up to there. Okay. So this is that extreme forecast for rapid ice melt scenario. So here is a little bit a complicated slide, so bear with me. So the time goes here from roughly 2000 to the end of the century. And what you have here is the storm flood elevations down at the tide gauge in Battery at the tip of Manhattan. This is the 10-year storm, or a storm that has a 10% chance to occur in any given year. That's the 100-year storm. That's a storm that has a 1% chance in any given year. The 500-year storm and a 700-year storm. Sandy was, by its coastal storm surge, a 700-year storm. And so it did a lot of flooding, both in the Hudson Valley and in the city. And so let's go right now to a subway entrance that flooded in downtown Manhattan during Sandy. And we march in and out of this same subway entrance. And we see that now in the year 2090 here, that same subway entrance gets flooded by a 10-year storm. Why is that so? Well, because all these storm surge heights get uplifted with sea level rise. And each storm is simply on the new established sea level. And so I used here this 90 percentile, which NBC recommends for planning purposes. And that's what you have. If you use that, then a 10-year storm will flood the same elevations that Sandy were flooded, which was a 700-year storm. If you divide 700 by 10, that's a 70-fold increase in the flood hazard. 70-fold increase.
Klaus, you have a question. Is the left column, does that represent feet?
The left column is feet here. Correct. So that was 11.5 feet down at the tide gauge of Battery Park City, above mean sea level. What was then mean sea level? Sea level rises, of course, and that's why all this stuff gets uplifted. But anyhow, that's a fixed datum that's not even attached to the water, it's attached to land. There's a marker on the land, and that's declared as 0, okay? So that's why we have to combine storm surges with sea level rise to fully understand our hazard exposure to coastal flooding. Very important. Now here I show some map of portions of New Jersey, Staten Island, Queens and Brooklyn, and Manhattan, and even the Bronx. What 3 feet of sea level rise, which would be roughly by year 2060 with this 90% level sea level rise forecast, would show up twice daily. The mean high water is where the high tides that show up twice a day would reach. So these blue areas here, that's would be flooded twice a day without any storm on a sunny day. That is the same thing by the year 2100 for 6 feet. And you see now that many of the areas, for instance, the Rockaways, but also in the area around Jamaica Bay, and forget the meadowlands with the Hackensack River here, and portions of along the Arthur Kill of Staten Island, but also on the fringes of Manhattan and in Harlem here, they would flood, would have water twice a day on the streets. When it gets to 10 feet, which would be either by 2100 with this rapid ice melt scenario comes about, or roughly by 2140 with the 90% sea level rise, then you see now we're starting to get really in trouble. Now even Kennedy Airport is flooded. And many other portions that before were flooded only during Sandy. If you compare that 10-foot sea level rise with Sandy, which after all was 11.5 feet, it looks very, very, very similar. That would be twice a day that the water would show up there. Now, here's Sandy. Sandy was only a Category 2 storm. not like Helena category 4, okay, or Milton a 3. And we already had in Florida, in the Caribbean, and Mexico, category 5 storms. Yeah. So it was only a category 2 storm, but it had a huge dimension. And in the northern hemisphere, storm systems around the low pressure cell rotate counterclockwise, like my pointer here. That means if you're on the right-hand side, the wind blows from the ocean to the land, and on the left-hand side, it blows from the land to the ocean. So that means most of the storm surge is here on the right-hand side. So if you have a home and you're on the right-hand side, quickly pack it up and move it to the left side if you want not being hit by the coastal storm surge. So this storm was in dimension large, and that's why it had a higher storm tide than a category 2 normally would have. It was just so much wind blowing the water towards the land here on the right-hand side. Here you see a few images several hours before Sandy made landfall, because Sandy made landfall on October 29th to 30th, when it was already dark in the night. So that's why these pictures are taken several hours before, when the sea level was still low, but the wind was already blowing. And even that shows that we have structures exposed to places which are not very smart in terms of their location. So there was a storm warning, of course. Many people followed the evacuation and were in these evacuation centers, but not everybody did. And when the rescue services wanted to get to them, they couldn't. So people were stranded. Now, many people had to leave their cars behind. There were tens of thousands of cars just in the larger metropolitan tri-state areas that got destroyed. I myself lost 2 cars in Sandy. That's why I'm an expert, right? Now, I had done a study in several years before Sandy arrived, together with colleagues from Columbia University in an engineering department, and we teamed up with the MTA to make a study what would be the effects of a Sandy-like storm on our transportation system, both Metro North, Long Island Railroad. But what we really focused on was the subway system. And here you see, this is lower Manhattan. This is the East River. This is Brooklyn here. And there are all these subways crossing. And those subway tunnels that are here in blue, we found would flood during a coastal storm surge that goes up and down, lasts for a few hours, and provides enough water on the streets to flow into the subway system through all the different openings. Where it's a dotted blue, it's only partially flooded. So people couldn't even stand on the platform, but maybe their head still would stick out. In the solid blue tunnels, it goes from the bottom to the ceiling. That's completely flooded. And so we published this report in 2011. That was 1 year before Sandy. Now, the MTA had this report. After all, we worked with them on that because they gave us all the data so we could do those computations. And what they did was very smart, much smarter than we had anticipated anybody would behave. Namely, since they had that map, they shut down the subway system 36 hours before landfall and sent technical teams into those blue tunnels here, both the dotted one and the solid one, and ripped out the electrical control and signal systems. So the brackish salt water wouldn't get into those devices. The tunnels flooded, they pumped them out, they took the mud out and reinstalled those. The pumping took 5-6 days. The reinstallation took only 1 day. After 1 week, the subway was running again. That was miraculous as far as I'm concerned, because we had anticipated it would take 4 to 6 weeks before they would get those devices repaired. If you realize that New York City's economic output is about $4 a day, and if you take only, let's say, a quarter because the transportation system doesn't work and people can't get to work, that saved the difference between 1 week and 4 or 6 weeks, saved the New York economy tens of billions of dollars that otherwise would have incurred by the metropolitan area. That was a real smart move by the MTA, and they never really got any thank you note by the media for it. They still got blamed that they were down for a week. Okay. That wasn't the only thing that was down. There was a transformation station here on the near 23rd Street on the East River in Lower Manhattan, and that got flooded out. And so much of Lower Manhattan, except the World Trade Center area, which had its own power because it's actually a state-owned and operated territory, believe it or not, got into a blackout for also almost a week. That area got named SOPO in analogy to Soho, but it stands not south of Houston, it stands south of power outage, and it was around here, around 42nd Street. That was a big problem, like in the rest of the Hudson Valley, some of us experience too, when the power goes out and you want to dry out your house or you want to pump out your basement, you need power, unless you have a strong generator to provide your own power temporarily. So that complicated the recovery efforts. Here in the Hudson Valley, in my own little village, Piermont, that's what it looked like. The marina got flooded, and all those boats that were parked here for winterization with the plastic cover ended up on Main Street, on River Road, and impacted some of the buildings and houses, and some of the houses sustained substantial damage simply from the impact of those. Of course, there was flood damage all along, all the way through the entire Hudson Valley, again, all the way up to Rensselaer. Now, here is a effort underway in Piermont right now to make a comprehensive plan how to set up the future land use and zoning and other policies that guide the future of a village like that. In many other communities in the Hudson Valley, for instance, Kingston has made quite some progress. Nyack is in the process of doing it, but many others too. And they are going through this process of making a comprehensive plan. Here's a map out of this comprehensive draft plan for Piermont. It's not yet completed, in which you see the current flood zone, which is here. I'm sitting here right now. No, actually here in the 100-year flood zone. And it goes along the riverfront. And here was this area that you just saw where all the boats got onto the river road here. But there's another kind of flooding shown here, which is marked here is 500-year flood zone, or 0.2% probability in any given year, which unfortunately is already outdated again. That is flooding that occurs during heavy rainfall. And during Ida, many of the houses here had water rushing down the slopes of the Palisades from 9W and even above 9W, which is this road here. And that water brought mud and filled some of the homes with mud. This affects quite a number of areas of Piedmont. And so if you are not on the coast, that doesn't mean you are safe from flooding. So you better check out what your conditions are. And if the water comes down behind your house, steep hill, how are you prepared for dealing with that or not? Now, the current flood condition, I said, is a 1% chance in 100 years, every 100 years. Well, look, when I go on my widow's walk on my own roof, that's what I see several times a year. This is the Spark Hill here. This is the Piedmont Marsh, and that's the Hudson River here. That's Westchester. But this is a road called Paradise Avenue, and it looks like a stream. And that, when I moved here in year 2001, happened maybe once or twice a year. Now it happens about 10 to 15 times a year. Sea level rise. And sometimes, if you don't watch out and don't listen to the warnings that the village puts out, then that happens. That's my car. Here is the title forecast. That's at the time when this shot was taken. This is a forecast, that's the past record. And you see how there was a coastal storm surge coming that was much higher than these flood warning zones here. Now, I knew that this would happen. So I set my alarm clock for 8 o'clock in the morning to move my car before it would go to here, not to speak of here. Well, 8 o'clock came, my alarm rang, I pushed the button, turned over, and kept sleeping. An hour and a half later, I came out, my car was flooded, total loss. Why? Because in our modern age where everything is digitally controlled, if the computer gets flooded, it's a total loss. So watch out, folks, and don't drive through flooded streets. Find another way to get out. Now, I showed you a map before, which was the current flood zone map. Now I've shown you a little bit of an enlarged map for the year 2080, when we expect about 60 inches or 5 feet of sea level rise, according to the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, so-called high forecast. This area now, that was largely the 1% year flood zone, and I showed you an image that this is not the case anymore. That's when, in the year 2080, that flooding will show up twice a day. twice a day. So it's practically, there may be a few hours where you can get in and out if you want to drive your car, unless you have an amphibious car, okay? This area that was before not affected is now in the 100-year flood zone. This is the main street here in Piermont, and this is the river road. And they are either permanently inundated, or at least they are, like here, or they are in the 100-year flood zone. So obviously, this village will have to do something about it. And hopefully we'll get either federal or state funding and some help to do something, because this is the major through-going traffic corridor and the business district. So depending on your community, this is really something that needs to be addressed, and it won't come cheap to fix it. This was all coastal flooding. Now, we have more severe rains, and Asheville, I said, had 2 feet of rain a month ago or so. In 2021, we had a post-tropical cyclone, Ida, that was a hurricane that came and became a Hurricane 4 here in red when it hit Louisiana. But when it made landfall, there is no nourishment from warm oceans when it's inland, so it quickly loses strength. But as it approached our area here, because of the counterclockwise rotation, it brought all that moisture in from the ocean ahead of its center of rotation. And that caused this humongous rainfall, which set a new hourly record in Central Park in New York City with more than 3 inches in a single hour. And the total rainfall during this event was more than 7 inches of rain, which is small compared to 24 inches in Asheville. But still, it caused a lot of problems. And interestingly enough, the record had been set just a month earlier for the hourly record with about 2 inches. And only a month later, it was broken again. So what does that mean? Well, if records are broken in such rapid sequence, that's called climate change. That's all that moisture that comes from the warm ocean in the warm air and then gets dropped on us. So from Ida, what were the impacts just for the eastern US? I don't deal here with New Orleans and Louisiana and other coastal areas down in the Gulf of Mexico. There were a total of 56 fatalities, most of them in New Jersey, 18 in New York State, 5 in Pennsylvania, 2 in Maryland, Connecticut, and Virginia. Of those 18 in the state, 13 were in New York City, of whom 11 died in dwellings, in basement dwellings in Queens. And we'll come back to that in a moment. The total flooding loss was in the order of $20 billion, which, if you compare that by Sandy, which was higher by a factor of 2 or so, it's nevertheless substantial. In terms of how it affected transportation, all subway lines were flooded. MTA buses were not running or very sparsely. Metro North was shut down because there was a landslide in Upper Manhattan that buried the tracks. Several Long Island Railroad lines were shut down. New Jersey Transit, except one line was shut down. So Amtrak trains in the entire northeastern corridor were suspended for at least 1 day. Even the New York State Thruway was closed for several hours. And Now, in the entire OS, I don't have it broken down for the Eastern OS, more than 200,000 cars got flash flooded out and destroyed. If you take even a minimal amount on average like that, that's alone right there, at least $1 billion or more, maybe several $1 billion. In terms of the housing stock, I don't know it in the Hudson Valley or in New Jersey, but in New York City, more than 1,000 buildings were reported to have sustained severe flood damage, and many more have light. 2,304 of New York City, 1,600 public school buildings were affected. And that's bad because that was just in September when the school year had started. And if you have mold in school buildings, that's not a good thing to send your kids to school with mold in the school, in the class, okay? These basement apartments in Queens were highly vulnerable, and they were the ones where they incurred the death. And here is a row in Queens that were heavily affected. So these basement apartments are down. Some of them are half basements or full basements. And the flooding came so rapidly that they couldn't get the doors open and got stuck and got killed. That's how it looked the next day when people dumped all their stuff onto the streets. It ain't nice to be flooded out. Now, flooding is only one hazard from climate change. And as said, the western states and Southwest sustain a lot of fire hazards, but we have to be careful here too. We are not immune from those. But here in the year 21, that shows how just in this one fire season where all the fires broke out and it affected many homes and entire neighborhoods and suburbia in particular. But even so these were in the West here, we were affected too, because all that soot in the air that came here arrived as a smog and made wonderful red sunsets. But if you have asthma, it was more than just a nice sunset. You may have to be at home and not go outside if you suffer from pulmonary complications from this heavy soot. So these can have long distance effect and not just where the fires themselves occur. Now, what do we do about all this? Well, after Sandy, the area awoke from a slumber, and the Federal Housing and Urban Development Corporation put out several $1 billion for a design competition, mostly for the tri-state area. And here's one of the winning designs, the so-called Big U, that wraps around the bottom of Manhattan in forms of levees, dikes that are disguised as parks, but sometimes also as seawalls and other structural methods to keep the water from running into the city. Now, they were broken down subsequently to different projects with different funding mechanisms, because this is funded by the state in the Battery Park City. This area has advanced. That's right now not finished, but under construction. The only one that didn't have money yet allotted to it was the financial district. Interesting, right? So then Mayor de Blasio had the great idea to do something about it, and I will get to that in a moment. But all these kinds of protection devices work for a few decades and are not long-term sustainable adaptation methods. So we will get back to that in a moment. So what was Mayor de Blasio's project. He wanted to build a new island in front of the financial district that was high enough to protect the area behind it. And then the private sector will build for a couple of $1 billion new offices and luxury condos, and that would do and protect the financial district from flooding. Well, people like me just shook their head, because all the areas here, they were formerly marshland and were filled in. And these are our flood zones now. So yes, it's built a little bit higher, but that just means it gets flooded later rather than sooner. So to put more assets into flood zones, future flood zones in this case, is not a smart way to make investments for the future. On the other hand, if you go a little bit farther up here in Midtown Manhattan on the east and look across the East River, that's what you see when you look over to Williamsburg here. That's the Queensboro Bridge. These blue-gray structures here are already completed and people have moved in. These red structures are just going up. So we are still building on the waterfront and putting more and more assets into harm's way. And that's not just in New York or New York City. That happens all along the Hudson River. Just go down to Edgewater, all those condos on the waterfront, down to Jersey City, they will be impacted without any protection. Well, really? Well, before I get to other methods, I want to point out the following. This is a map where each of those red dots is a real estate transactions for 1 to 3 family homes only, not big buildings, just 1 to 3 family homes. And only those that are in flood zones that will be affected by the year 2050, they will be in the 100-year flood zone. 2050, that's when their mortgage is already overdue, because typically mortgages can be 30 years. So we spend, or people spend, private money in the order of $3.6 billion, at least in the 5 boroughs of New York City, buying houses in flood zones. Wow. In a way, you have to ask yourself, what's going on? Where is the public education to prevent such nuisance? Here are the numbers. It's quite interesting. The highest number was in Brooklyn, followed by here more than 2,000 units in Brooklyn and more than 2,000 in Queens, and fewer in Staten Island and the Bronx. Manhattan was only 31, but look at the unit price. Here, average sales price. These are roughly $500,000 a piece. Okay, these 1 to 3 family houses. In Manhattan, there's 6 million. So the total value then is not that different from borough to borough, but the numbers are very different. That just tells you what's going on in the real estate market and how short-sighted the real estate market is. Now, then there were some other people said, oh, no problem, you can solve all these issues. Nobody has to retrofit anything here, or you don't have to build a big U around Manhattan. Or so we're building 1, 2, 3 Dutch-style barriers and keep the storm surges out. And that leaves still Kenny Airport and Jamaica Bay open, so we have to put another one there if we want to protect that area, and we are done. Very smart, right? Very effective protection for the whole area. And then the US Army Corps of Engineers came along and said, oh, we can do even better. We just built two. We built one here near the Whitestone Bridge, which would be that one here. And then we built a system that goes from Coney Island to Sandy Hook in New Jersey. And it keeps the entire both Hudson Valley and Raritan River system and Hackensack River. So both New Jersey and New York tidal estuaries protected from storm surges. Great, right? Well, not so great if you really think it through. Why is that so? Well, at current sea level, those barriers are open most of the time and you close them only during storm surges. But now sea level rise is rising. And as I said, these areas here get inundated. So you might want to start closing that more often. And eventually, by the year 2090, 2100, if the sea level rise reaches sandy elevations, you better have them permanently closed, because otherwise the areas are flooded just like during Sandy, permanently. Well, make those barriers closed and just keep the ocean open out. What's the problem? Well, there is a problem, because we have a Hudson River, we have a Raritan River, and even a little Hackensack River, and they want to send their water out to the ocean. But the barriers are closed, so they can't get out, so you get flooded from behind. And you get flooded as high as those barriers would be, which would be even higher than the ocean. So you have to open them, okay, to let the water out to the ocean. Well, then it equalizes and sea level rise floods the entire harbor and estuaries. So again, this is right now a good short to midterm solution for several decades. And in fact, it is a good solution for storm surges only ad infinitum if you make those barriers high enough. And I give you enough money to make them as high as you want. But it doesn't solve the sea level rise problem. And so right now, the Army Corps of Engineers got a lot of negative feedback because of the sea level rise problem. And the whole project is on halt. And it's not clear where it will go. So there are all sorts of negotiations between the feds and the states and local communities how to deal with that issue. So maybe we'll get some barriers, but that doesn't prevent us from doing something about sea level rise behind the barriers. That's very expensive proposal to do. The barriers cost only about, well, according to the Army Corps engineer, $60 billion. Most people think it's 100 to 150. Okay. But as I said, it doesn't solve the sea level rise problem. So what are the basic methods for adaptation? Well, protection is one thing, and we just discussed it, both around Manhattan, but also with those barriers, sealing of the harbor. And that goes, as I said, for a few decades very well. Accommodation, I haven't talked much about it. That's when you raise your house on stilts, which many houses have done successfully in Florida, unless the wind takes them down. The problem is also you can't get in and out of those buildings during ever rising sea level rise. The buildings may be okay for a couple of decades, but your living conditions may be severely impacted. The only long-term sustainable solution is strategic retreat or relocation to higher ground. Entire neighborhoods, city blocks, you name it, may have to migrate to higher elevation. Now, if you are in Florida or in Miami, there's no high elevation. Forget it. You have to leave Florida. New York and many communities in the Hudson Valleys, not so much in New Jersey, but okay, a little bit too, have elevation. So in principle, there's the option to retreat if we get our land use and zoning right and rezoning for higher density. But then there's the NIMBY effect. The people that live in the low density, high areas, they don't want to have more people coming in their neighborhoods. So it becomes a political hot topic, a hot potato. I show here a few circles in the New York City area in red that show areas that are at high elevation that have no housing, no streets on it at all. They are cemeteries. So sometimes I facetiously say we have to switch the living and the dead. Those under the ground probably won't mind if they have to move to flood zones. And those who will be allowed to move might really appreciate it. So that's a little bit of far-fetched thought, but since many of those cemeteries are actually privately owned, well, this one is a landmark. That's the in Brooklyn. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's really severe pressure on those owners, private owners of those cemeteries, to actually sell them for future development. So that is, there's other terrain that we can consider, but then we have to deal with this NIMBY, not in my neighborhood, issue. Have we moved in that direction yet? Well, here I chose an example from Manhattan. This is a checkerboard of census tracts. The blue census tracts, we have quite strongly increased the population. And in the red neighborhoods, people have moved out because it's getting too expensive. They have to leave Manhattan, go somewhere else. And so people that can afford to stay there tear down 2 apartments into 1. So with the consequence that we have lost population in those red areas. If you compare the red areas with the topography map and the blue areas with the topography map, you can see we have lost population in the high elevation areas. And we have put more and more people in the low-lying flood risk areas. We are still doing it the wrong way. And so I urge you to talk to your politicians to safeguard your community. This is the city, but the same thing is going along the Hudson River and shoreline of New Jersey in many, many, many communities. Kingston is a little bit ahead of the game. They are making really progress. They're thinking about many of those things. So, in terms getting back to short-term protection, in particular the floodway, where the water just comes to the ventilation grates on the sidewalks and runs down and then floods those tunnels. Well, this is what the MTA has done, something really smart. They put these devices here into the ventilation grates, which this grid here gets moved back over it when the people have left. And what happens is the first few gallons of water flow into buckets that sit here, and by gravity, it flips over a device here that shuts off the opening and makes it flood-proof. Very smart device, doesn't need any man or woman power to handle it. So it does it all by itself and doesn't even need electric or any other power. Okay. On the other hand, many of the larger devices, like here, the entrance to the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel that got badly flooded during Sandy, they installed these gates, and you need people to go there and close them. And hopefully they do that in due time. In some other parts, this is on 4th Avenue in Brooklyn, there is a ventilation grate under this little device here that sits on the sidewalk, which is a little bit higher than the road, and then it's higher than the sidewalk. So a few inches of flooding that occurs very often doesn't get into the subway through that ventilation grate. And then they transform that into a bench and a bicycle stand, so it has a little better purpose even on sunny days when there's no flooding going on. Now, here I show you another example from my neighborhood in Piermont, which is really bizarre. When I look out my window here, that's what I look at. This is a new house. This is not a hunting blind to shoot ducks in the Piermont Marsh or on the Spark Hill here behind this property. This is a house where people intend to live in. And why is it so high? Because the Piermont Building Code, together with flood zone recommendations by the state, this is the new first floor flood elevation that the first floor has to be raised to. Sandy went up to here at this roof of this temporary outhouse is about here. So there's a little bit additional room here for sea level rise, and that's why it's up there now. Okay. Now, where those people park their car, I don't know if they will install a crane and lift it up on the roof or whatever, or if they have a heart attack during the next storm and the emergency services can't get to it, or the garbage gets picked up by a barge, or I don't know how Piermont will handle that. Maybe they will buy an amphibious car. Anyhow, they got actually an offer to be bought out this property, and they turned down that buyout proposal by the village and county and said, no, we want this house, we want to look over the Piermont Marsh. Well, as long as it's not in the comprehensive plan, the village has no legal means. If they would deny them to build, the owner could sue the village and probably would win. Okay. That's the land use right that is unfortunately still in place in many communities and jurisdictions. And you know, the state has set aside billions of dollars for flood mitigation funding to communities to buy out some properties. And that's gradually coming online. It's not yet in place, but just about. Hochul just signed another law that makes it actually happening. Okay. So, you know, sure, the house is safe, but life is not safe. Don't do that, please. Go and look for higher ground. So, in summary, mitigation and adaptation are both equally urgent. That means we shouldn't send more greenhouse gases. We have to wean ourselves from fossil fuels as quickly as possible. But adaptation is badly needed, whether it's temporary or sustainable, by moving to higher ground. Mitigation, meaning the greenhouse gas reduction, tends to be a top-down from federal government, even international Paris Agreement, to state and local community, even to the household electric cars. The adaptation works best from bottom up because adaptation is so locality specific. You can't come up with rules that apply equally for Louisiana and New Orleans as it would apply to New York City or the Hudson Valley in New Jersey. But both mitigation and adaptation need huge financing, both from the public and the private sector. And they have to be smart investments by the private sector, not misinvestments as I have described them before. This will cost in the years and decades ahead trillions, tens of trillions of dollars. So our economy has to be prepared for that. And if we don't do it, it will cost multiple trillions of dollars more than these adaptation and mitigation measures by incurred losses. And in particular, that's true for future generations. But even in our decades, and we see that, of course, in Florida, Louisiana, and coastal areas in general, not just in the US, all around the globe. This is a big equity issue, both intergenerationally between us and future generations, but also spatially, because many people that are now already affected are poor neighborhoods. They can't move on their own. Or think of globally, of the atoll islands in the Pacific. They haven't contributed to the greenhouse gas emissions, and they already have to leave their atolls. Entire nations will disappear, not only in decades, but even in years ahead of now. So many of the currently implemented resiliency measures are only a temporary fix and de facto only delay the sustainable solutions, namely retreat to higher ground, relocation of our infrastructure to higher ground. Or think of the Metro North. We would have to put them on pylons up in the air, okay, if we want to keep them in the same right of way, but lift them up on superstructures like elevated highways. And in Taiwan and other parts of the world, you find bullet trains, or in Japan, that are elevated, and they have been doing that for other reasons for quite some time. So maybe the Metro North will be in the future a bullet train, okay, on an elevated right-of-way. But that costs all money and political will and a sense of urgency that has to be community supported and driven. Now, there was a guy a couple of thousand years back. His name was Noah. He was a smart guy. He knew what managed retreat means. Not only did he take himself and moved to higher ground with this incredibly resilient little island here, but he was very ecumenical. He took even quite a number of animals with him too. They also have to retreat. They can't live underwater. And don't be one of those dinosaurs. Timing can be very crucial. And thank you. And with that, I'm open to questions, maybe both in the chat and otherwise.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. I know I learned a lot. Okay, so let's see. Please, everyone, if you want, you can raise your hands. You could either physically do it, or there's 3 dots there. I believe that's where you can find the reactions. And then if you click on reactions, you should be able to raise your hand. Gail and Harry, I don't know if you're seeing questions. I did see a couple of comments that sort of lead to questions. One of them was Mayor Adams had a big opening of some system in the news last week relating to sea level rise. Can you tell us more about that?
I don't know much more about that. All I saw was a quick
Oh,
clip
So
of
no,
it on
I'm asking.
Oh,
Klaus.
him. Yeah,
Yeah.
of course.
Okay, Klaus, you want to answer that? And maybe stop sharing your screen.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, do you know anything about this?
Well, there are many efforts underway. One is a proposal that's worked out also through the city council, the legislative part of the city. It's called the Transportation-Oriented Development on the Interborough Connector, meaning from Queens to Brooklyn, along those End Moraine high elevations, where they are planning to put first a new transportation system in, and then along that corridor would rezone to have higher density. But there is a real problem in the city council, of course, because they get feedback from their communities and said, no, we don't want this in our neighborhood. There was another plan, not sure which one that comment refers to, where New York City will help houses that have repeated flooding problems to help them to make resilient. Not sure where that stands. I know that has been going on, but this is all in parallel to the DEP, the Department of Environmental Protection, working on improving the sewer system and drainage system in some of those neighborhoods, particularly in Queens. So there are all these parallel efforts going on. But interestingly enough, New York City doesn't really have a comprehensive plan. And without a comprehensive plan, at least a vision, it doesn't have to be a plan, it has to be at least a vision that then individual political steps can fit into this larger checkerboard. It will be very difficult to come to a sustainable solution and not make misinvestments in just short-term projects that will work for a while, but then ultimately have to be given up.
So I'd like to kind of sort of tag on another question onto your answer. And that is, doesn't it really need to be regional planning? I mean, I'm thinking about the infrastructure. I'm thinking about the trains leading everybody into Manhattan, the funneling everybody, the airports, all of this. You
Yeah, well, that's
kind
why
of
we
build
have-
around it, right? What can we do about the infrastructure? What could
Well,
be done
that's
with the
why we have
airports and the trains?
agencies like the MTA
Mhm.
runs all these regional transportation systems. But it's a state-funded agency. So the upstate people decide about the area that's where the MTA has operations, whether or not they will be made resilient, because it's a state agency. So it needs the state senate, the state assembly, and the governor all working together to make decisions to finance that. They can tap into some federal funding, but that's only in the billions and tens of billions of dollars. These projects will cost ultimately hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars. So we need a federal comprehensive plan, or vision at least, and on the state, on the city level, and on regional level. Yes, but it's very hard. Even so, the MTA, or for instance, the Port Authority, after all, it's a Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. You know, they get funded by both the two states, New York and New Jersey. Well, that means they all have to be working together to get those things done. And our political process is much too slow compared to how quickly climate change is changing.
Okay.
So it's up to you folks in the election to put the right people into place.
Amen on that one. Okay, so we have a few questions. Jackie and then Anne, go ahead. And then there's one in the chat.
Yes, thanks for this, Peggy, and especially Professor Jacob. So, you know, you started off the whole thing, we were talking about the storm that hit, was it Helene? Not Florida, in North Carolina?
North Carolina, in Asheville.
Yeah. And so that was like 150 miles inland, and it was because of the massive amount of humidity in the atmosphere, and it, you know,
It rained 2 feet of water down.
right. So when you say find higher ground, when we know that these storms are longer lasting storms being pushed further inland, it's not just the coastal thing. And then there's the whole issue of then the whole infrastructure then has to be raised up to the level of where that new high level is. I know that it's just kind of scary. I mean, I live up on top of a mountain where I suppose we could be hit by a mudslide from further up above us. But we're above Nyack, and to think that Nyack could flood and then we're up here and then you can't get to anywhere because there's no, it's just it's so overwhelming to think about. But I also was thinking, you know, there's been a lot of talk about the Climate Superfund Act, which would bring about, they're thinking about $3 billion a year into New York State coffers to help mitigate climate change from polluters that have known about all of this for all of these years. Now that's not, and it would be for 25 years. I think about $2 billion would go for general sustainability and mitigation, and $1 billion maybe would be going to communities that are frontline communities, but it's over 25 years, $3 billion a year, if they could enforce the payment of that. So I mean, that's some way of getting some funding, right? Because
yeah, but that's breadcrumbs, Jackie. I mean, look, if you just want to raise a few miles of the Metro North, that costs you $1 billion. So, I mean, we are in total denial at the tasks ahead of us. So the politicians pat themselves on the back by saying, "Oh, there's this climate superfund and it raises $3 billion a year." That would maybe roughly 10 miles of Metro North per year raise it. Okay.
So let's move on to the next question. Anne, you had a question?
Yeah, okay. Couple of things. Peggy, I really think you should get in touch with Mallory with their opposed to the HATS plan by the Army Corps of Engineers for flood mitigation. It's a beautiful report. I can't really quote it because I'm not an expert like that, but get in touch with Mallory on that, I think.
I sent a meeting notice to Mallory and the committee.
Yeah, okay, good. Okay, well, hopefully
And,
she'll
and
see
this recording will be available afterwards
Right.
too.
fantastic. The other concern has to do with the waste that is exacerbated, the waste issues that are exacerbated by the flooding. I watched waste truck after waste truck go up the thruway after Sandy to landfills in upstate New York. We're asking, the New York City may be asking for funding from upstate New York to help with this issue, but there's a little bit of a challenge that's going to come out of this. So there's always an issue between what's where not in my wallet type of thing from upstate as far as helping to mitigate the downstate. So just it's kind of unrelated, but it's kind of related, you know.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the flooding of pollutants is just a major concern. And how is that addressed? When it's flooded, you've got, if the JFK is flooded, that's incredible pollutants. You've got the old oil tanks and Bayonne, New Jersey, and all that stuff is just that's something that really somehow can that be. People need an advanced view of that, and I was really glad to hear your that the MTA has forward vision. I thought that was a very positive aspect of the report. They deserve an award or something for what they did. So thank you very much. It's been very elucidating.
Well, I want to comment on your remarks. It's not just the solid waste or the pollutant water. Think of all the wastewater treatment plants. They're all, for all our communities, they're down on the Hudson or on the waterfront. Why? Because they have to be on the lowest point where the water flows to. And so that entire wastewater treatment infrastructure will have to be rethought. And once you do that, then you have to include the whole sewer system that leads down to them. If now the wastewater treatment plants are higher, you have to pump the wastewater up to them. So, I mean, it needs comprehensive approaches. And right now, we are twiddling around on breadcrumbs here, breadcrumbs there, and big loaves of risks are being baked right now by climate change. And we are not prepared to deal with that situation if we just keep tinkerlitzing on these little breadcrumb solutions.
Larry, you have a question?
Yes, Dr. Jacob, I was attending your lecture here about 7 years ago, and I was pretty shaken by it. I grew up in Rockaway Park from the late 40s, 50s, and 60s. There were 3 hurricanes that flooded our building. And my parents finally sold in the 1970s, moved to Florida. And a couple of years ago, I visited the house, and the new owner said that they were flooded 7 feet by Sandy. I think the problem with all of these barrier plans is that the Rockaway Peninsula is only a few feet above high tide right now. And eventually, rising sea level and surges will just flow through and break through, flood Jamaica Bay. And this may happen in other places too, based on your diagram down towards New Jersey as well. So it doesn't make much sense. I don't think anybody should be building in Rockaway or anywhere around Jamaica Bay. I don't think there should be new building permits permitted. And unfortunately, people are going to lose money, just like the people in Asheville lost everything, not expecting to lose everything. So I think we're in really deep, as they say, deep doo-doo. And we really have to get whoever gets elected, I hope it's a Democrat, get them to make this a high priority. One other comment, an engineer who worked for the Port Authority in the new Freedom Tower, after Sandy, he told me they spent $100 million to raise their infrastructure equipment to higher levels. So it's not cheap to remediate things. And I think your comments about sewage and sewage treatment is very prescient. Thank you.
So I have another question for you also from the chat. What issues arise with saltwater contamination of fresh water with sea level rise in terms of
That
drinking
is,
water and infrastructure?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, this is already a problem, for instance, in many areas out in Long Island, where they are taking groundwater for supplying the population with fresh water and irrigate much of the agriculture out there. And they have ever more saltwater intrusion into their groundwater horizons. So they're pumping out water, which then accelerates the inflow from seawater. And so they are starting already to irrigate some of the vineyards and potato fields with slightly brackish water, and will get ever more brackish. Eventually, the freshwater supply to the population and for industrial use and commercial use will be affected too. And not just in Long Island. As sea level rises in the fall, like right now, when the flow of the Hudson is very low from the Adirondacks down to Manhattan and into the ocean, the salt water intrudes into the Hudson and moves up the so-called saltwater front that moves up in the deep channel of the Hudson. And for instance, Poughkeepsie and several other communities in the Hudson Valley rely on their fresh water supply from taking it out of the Hudson. Now, if that salt water gets ever farther upstream, particularly in the fall, in the low rainy season, then Poughkeepsie will have no freshwater supply. They have to hook into something else. And that's just one example. It goes on and on and on and on.
Deep sigh. Yeah. Other questions? I mean, there are a few others, possible questions, and then maybe we should start to wrap it up. But
Well, I had a
is-
comment, but not a question. I put it in the chat. Maybe Klaus
okay,
could
I'll
look at
take a
that.
look. Is FEMA currently planning or beginning to, like, do they have a systematic process for kind of switching from, you know, reimbursing people so that they can repair and rebuild to, you know, are they already doing this or beginning to figure out how to, which, you know, like having a system to prioritize places where they will now offer buyouts rather than money to rebuild?
Well,
I'm asking.
there are multiple funding streams that come from FEMA, but it's again a drop in a big bucket. And they come essentially in two forms. There are either people that have national flood insurance for their homes, or must have them because they have a mortgage and then they're obliged to carry national flood insurance. There is a certain funding mechanism after a flooding event, but it has a ceiling, so you don't get the total loss, you get only a portion of it back. And the premiums rising and rising, and the National Flood Insurance Program is by tens of billions in the red. Yeah. It's uninsurable, essentially, the inventory. So that you get squeezed now with ever higher premiums and the reimbursements being capped on top. So get squeezed between the ceiling and that rising premium sea level rise. Okay. The other funding stream from FEMA is disaster relief. That has nothing to do with flood insurance. If you really lost a major portion of your livelihood and don't have the funds to fix anything, you are entitled to receive funds, but again, it covers only portions. For instance, if you have to move, like many people in Asheville in North Carolina, they're still not back, and they cannot be back because there's no water and no power. They are supposed to apply to FEMA to get their Airbnb or wherever they stay paid, okay? But then they come back and still have to fix their home. So, and then there's the Small Business Administration that can help business in giving not relief, but low interest funding. But these are loans. The businesses will have to pay them back sooner or later. So these are all sort of old-fashioned mechanisms that are in place that will be totally blown up by what is in the making from climate change. So
Joss, yeah, go ahead, I'm sorry.
now enough said.
Okay, Jossie?
Yes, a couple of things on that note. Is there some way that, for instance, the government not just would buy people out whose homes have been totally destroyed and who are now in, 500-year flood zone mappage and they can't get insurance, in some way to encourage them financially to move to a higher ground, whereby there might be communities that can be newly created that are taking into account all of the problems that we're suffering with climate change right now and the imperative need to seek higher ground and create communities that can function on higher ground, with markets and crafts and goods and the things people need to survive, and food, and that these are places that can be like properly thought out to
Let's let Professor Jacob answer.
And
Yes,
just
yeah.
one other
Yeah.
thing, I think there are two communities in Florida that have survived these two major storms that happened in the last couple of years. They're kind of brilliant communities that didn't really have any damage from
Well,
these storms.
They put these so-called tiger dams up, which are temporary barriers that keep flood water out up to a certain height, okay? So, as I said earlier, there are federal programs, state programs, and local programs that try to address those things. New York State passed the Bond Act, okay? That's a few $1 billion a year, and we discussed that earlier. That's nice, but it's breadcrumbs in terms of what's needed. And even if the people that get bought out, like some communities have been bought out, a few in Rockaways, but more so in Staten Island, for instance, where do they move? We have a housing shortage anyhow. So if you sell your house, where do you move? Do you have the funds to move somewhere at an affordable price? So that's why we heard from one of the presidential candidates emphasizing to come up with a major housing funding project on the federal level. Okay, so these are things that are being more talked about it rather than yet in place, but at least the conversations go in the right directions. But we as voters have to make sure that we vote the people that put those things into law and then put some financing behind it. It's as simple as that.
So I know we should start to wrap up. Maybe I want to jump in with just one very question that might be a quick question. What do you have an estimate for? Obviously, we're going to see climate refugees as people move away from not just in the United States, but all around the world, Bangladesh, whatever, all around the world. Is there an estimate that you have for how many hundreds of millions or billions of climate refugees we might see from this? And then Anne, your question.
The estimates range from 100 millions to billions, and of course, it gets worse with time. In Bangladesh alone, a few billion people will have to move. Low-lying parts of Vietnam makes another billion. So globally, a billion, no, sorry, then I misspoke. So globally, the population of the Earth is about 8.5 and moving towards 9. Many models say that we are petering out somewhere between the 9 and 10 billion dollars, 9 and 10 billion people, and but these are models. These are not necessarily a realistic forecast, but about 10% of them will become sooner or later, before the end of this century, climate refugees.
Thank you. Okay, Anne, and then
Yeah,
maybe we should
really,
wrap up there. Yeah.
it was just a response to Josie really quickly, and I think it is in the it's in the realm of the medium to short term, not entirely sustainable solution. But in the barrier reefs near New Orleans, there was an entire community that was moved 60 feet away, and they rebuilt their whole community, and all the neighbors are neighbors again. But it's 60 miles. How long is that going to last? I couldn't say. Thank you very much, Professor Jacob.
That was a native community that got funding from the Bureau of Land Management because they lived on an island in the bayous, and so they moved inland, still in Louisiana. Probably they will be safe for several decades at least, if not longer.
So Simon Skolnick brings up an issue, and I know it's, we should wrap up, so I think it may be too late to, but just to kind of summarize his question, I think what he's talking about is the political difficulty of confronting this, that politicians it's just going to be so hard for them to bring up the whole, I think we all get it about the need for managed retreat, but
well, that's why
how do we get this across
like
politically? Yeah.
That's why organizations like the Sierra Club that tries to educate the public are so important. So good luck. You have cut out your work for yourself.
Well, one thing we can do, okay, one more quick question from one person. Has New Jersey been working on planning around their shorelines as well?
Actually, in a way, New Jersey is a little bit ahead of New York State. They have dealt with some of those issues for quite some time. And that doesn't mean it's all nice and good, but it's better than New York. Okay. I forgot what their program is called. So they really started to look into zoning with climate change and sea level rise and flooding issues as a major component for their zoning, rezoning issues and land use policy.
Can I jump in with one last question? And that is, so everybody's always saying the Netherlands, they're the model. But my understanding is that they're having to redo everything too, that they're really experiencing or expecting to experience problems as well. Is that correct?
Well, they always have been the model population nation in the past because they are essentially below sea level. You know, 3/4 of the nation is below sea level. And they built those dikes and dams. And of course, in the 1950s, there was a big storm in the North Sea, and that motivated them even more to build these structural systems to protect the nation. But that was all when sea level rise wasn't a major issue. It was just storm issues. And now the Netherlands, just like I described with the HATS program, that it's good for storm surges, but not for sea level rise, they deal with those issues too. And often I have many high-level administrative friends in the Netherlands. I ask them, have you made friends with the Austrians, Swiss, French, and German and Italians? Because that's where you will find yourself sometime sooner or later. So they're struggling with that too. They are not exempt from all those problems.
Well, thank you so much. Everybody is saying thank you, and I'm seeing lots of thank yous in the chat. I will, hopefully this recording has worked well, and we can have it available on, I know Professor Jacob, you wanted a copy of it. For sure, we can do that, and we can also post it on the website. And somebody says he's clapping. People are saying thank you, and we can look into. I'm not very good on the tech issues, but we can figure out if there's a way to at least to send a link or to send the recording as well. So thank you very much. We really appreciate it. We appreciate all of your work. It's, can I say, it's
I hope
sobering.
you don't lose your sleep tonight.
Yeah, I think what we should all be doing maybe is thinking about forwarding the recording to our elected officials. And to the candidates. I think that's what we should be doing. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending. I can stay on for a few minutes in case there are questions or comments. But thank you, everybody the co-sponsors, everybody who forwarded it, all of you who attended. I hope you found it informative. I know I did.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. I have a request for the PowerPoint as well from the chat. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
I send it to you or other
Yeah.
colleagues. Feel free to distribute it. The only thing
Okay.
I require, if you use it or a portion of it, it has to be attributed where it came from.
Okay, for sure. No problem about that at all. Okay.
Peggy?
Yes.
Yeah, with regard to your last suggestion about circulating the presentation to government representatives, I would strongly recommend taking sections or a tidbit and making something on the length of 7 or 8 minutes at most. And you might say, well, how do we distill this to 7 or 8 minutes?
Okay.
Well, there are certain things that you're requesting that government officials do. And
Mhm.
it's the action items and the thinking
Mhm.
that you want to educate them on. There was one particular slide that the professor showed that if you just look at storm surge, it's a 10-year, it's a, oh boy, 700-year
Yes,
flood.
yes,
And if
I
you
know
look at
exactly which one. The
uh,
one that, where he used the
yeah,
example of Hurricane Sandy. Yep.
yeah, the 10-year versus 700.
Mhm.
That to me, is something that they may react to, but for the typical politician, they don't have the 2 hours that we just spent to really deep dive into this. I think your idea is excellent. And although you also said you're not in IT, there are many young people.
Mhm.
There's a climate sort of summit for high school students coming up next week. That would be an excellent opportunity for them to say, here's a video, see what you can do with it to distill it to send it to the politicians. I don't know what the average age here was tonight because I don't know all the people who were faceless like myself, but I encourage Sierra Club. I know Sarah Wilson um, and Liam to get their younger members involved. And it may start with something like technology or emailing such a link or posting it on Facebook or putting it on TikTok or whatever. But you're probably, Professor, talking to the chorus here tonight, and that's why Peggy's idea is to hit the offices of the elected officials. Obviously, there's 2 weeks left. Um, they're not going to view anything in these 2 weeks.
Well, there will be future elections, so don't stop just in 2 weeks.
No, I understand. You need to indoctrinate those who come in. So I'll stop
It's,
talking. I'll
no,
be
Mark,
quiet.
these are great ideas. Maybe if you want, put your email, email you or in the chat to me, and maybe we could figure something out. I think we'd have to, if we're going to do it as a recording, we would have to run it past Professor Jacob, or we could possibly say, I've seen this done before, here, I'm forwarding you this presentation. If you listen from minutes, whatever it
Yeah.
was, 35 on, you're going to get the section that's on resilience, which is really, I think, pretty much what you're talking about. You have to kind of show people the problem, how much is going to be flooded before. So, I don't think we can alter the presentation without
Well,
Professor Jacob's permission, but maybe, and then maybe we can do the same thing with the slides and say, please look at slides, whatever it is, 30 through 35 or something like that.
Professor Jacobs, you've given many lectures, I assume, and therefore you know that students will, when they study for exams, they don't listen to the whole recording again. They go to
One a week, and many schools I go to.
Yeah, they'll take tidbits.
Karen suggests sends it to the science department at Dominican College. The professor could have one of her students work on it. That's true, and I feel like we could find somebody. Gabriella, you had your hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to comment on the difficulty of a managed retreat. I'm from the Coalition for Wetlands and Forests, and we're right on Arthur Hill in Staten Island. Staten Island's 24 plus people died on Staten Island during Hurricane Sandy. I was there before, during, and after. Then I started the coalition. But we have right near us, on the other side of the wetland that we're fighting to keep, is a mobile home community. It's the only one in the city. They're elderly, disabled, and low-income people. We involve them a lot. But I've asked the residents about what will you do if there's flooding coming, and they said they won't leave. lots of them told me that they spent 30 years living here, they raised their grandchildren here, they're not gonna leave. So that's part of the difficulty of moving.
On the other hand, there was a community in Staten Island down on, what is it, Orchard Beach or whatever, where the community organized itself. And in the order of 120 houses in that community were bought out. Yeah.
Yeah, I know the person that did that.
So it was actually a real estate guy who organized the
Yes.
community.
Yes, I know Joe. I'm on his last name. His name is Joe. I know him. Yes, he
Right.
did. And there was a big buyout there. But with old people, you've got neighbors that have known each other for each other, and they help each other out. You've got
Well,
doctor
you know, you
appointments, and
have to
you've got
provide
all of
them.
those things.
Gabriella,
but-
you have to provide them with opportunities. Right now, they don't see an option for them to move. And so, of course, they don't want to move. If you really provide them with options that are attractive, maybe you can get them to move.
I think if they moved as a community, that would be possibly an option. But the
Yeah.
other thing too is that we are right across the street from, we fought for 4 years, now it's 7 years, to protect the 18-acre wetland right across the street from us. I said for 4 years that if we lose it, we'll be flooded. They cut the trees down, compacted the soil in 2021, and the next day we were flooded for the first time ever.
Wow.
Wow, that's pretty dramatic.
I just
Chelsea,
quickly
go ahead.
wanted to say that that's sort of what I was talking about before with incentives to get people to move to higher ground. Like, you have to make it appealing to them to move as a community, maybe as a group of people, to another place where they'll be safe and they can have a good quality of life as you know, they're aging. That's kind of what I was talking about before. I didn't explain it very well, but you just explained it now. There
Except-
has to be a way of being able to accommodate that, you know?
You
Where they
probably
don't
need
feel
to
the
purchase
loss.
the,
Where the NIMBY effect comes in. Which
well,
neighbor wants to take on a whole neighborhood? Okay.
you probably need to buy the property beforehand and then convince them to move there.
Yeah. Mhm.
How do you do that? I mean, the political situation here is tremendous. It's not in a good way. Terrifying is more like it. And we've tried for a long time. We don't have many people supporting us, but we've kept them out of the ground for 7 years. They cut down the trees, but we've kept them out of the ground.
Wow.
Yeah.
Mm.
There are
Thank you. This
examples.
was wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, I
This
want to
was
let
so
you
great.
let
Thank
you
you,
go,
too.
Professor Jacob. I know you said something about having something else that you wanted to do afterwards, and I'm afraid we've
Well,
run over.
We're into that.
Yeah.
For one, those people, I may be late.
Okay, okay.
Okay,
I really,
but I would
really
like to
let's
leave.
thank you very, very much. It was
Okay,
excellent.
good night.
Yeah. Good night,
Yeah.
everybody. Okay, good night. Anybody who wants to, you're welcome to put your email in the chat if you want to be added to an email list.
I did
can
add my
also-
email to the chat.
To the chat. Okay, you can also email me. My email is pkurtz9, PKURTZ, the number 9 @gmail.com.
Okay.
Okay, and I'm always glad to talk.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Any last comments, questions? Renita, I see.
Thank you, Peggy.
Sure, thanks, Rob. Talk soon. Okay, okay. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Okay.
All right.